Okay, I think we can get underway. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ZS Associates and BeeKeeperAI webinar on accelerating clinical decision support solutions to create real-world impact. I'm so thrilled to be able to be with you today. I'm Mary Beth Chalk, the co-founder and chief commercial officer of BeeKeeperAI. And joining me today are my distinguished colleagues from ZS Associates, Chen Yi and Maurice Solomon. And I'm so thrilled that they could join me in talking about this critical topic of clinical decision support and impacting real-world outcomes. So as we move through our observations and case studies today, please feel free to pose any questions in the Q&A button at the top of your screen. We've allocated time at the end of the webinar to address those questions and any comments, and would really welcome your interactivity during this session. So thank you for completing the registration survey. The responses will remain confidential, but in aggregate were extremely helpful in preparing the content for this webinar. Also, we were encouraged to see the diversity of stakeholders who are attending, because as you will learn, multi-stakeholder collaborations are one of the key drivers of a success with clinical decision support solutions, which throughout the rest of this webinar, we will also refer to as CDS. So without further ado, Maurice, thank you for setting the context for the CDS solutions.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maurice Solomon with ZS's Digital Connected Health Practice, focusing on strategy and go-to-market in digital health, and also one of the co-leaders in our deployed AI working group. So briefly, thought to kind of level set around clinical decision support, this term, and there's the premise that CDS is not all AI. This chart lays out kind of the full continuum with which our team, for instance, has worked in support of various healthcare stakeholders around clinical decision support. Some of it is simply kind of over the course of patient care, kind of bringing data together and simplifying complex decisions, things like guidelines, care pathways, pursuit lists, or other population health concepts can actually be very powerful and can have a relatively spotty presence in various corners of the healthcare system, can be TA dependent, organization dependent, etc. The creation of kind of rules-based logic or to simplify complex decisions is another area where different actors can influence and improve the provision of care. But moving to the right on this chart, we have the opportunity to add new data points or digital markers to enhance decision-making or to create new prognostic indicators or risk scores, new algorithms. And that's where AI/ML methods come in. And that's where some of the more interesting regulatory considerations come in as we think about new ways, basically bringing new ways to the table of supporting improved care. And these tools we've seen can be deployed throughout kind of the patient journey, from screening and identification or enhancing our ability to identify patients, all the way through kind of risk stratification and treatment optimization. And with that, with the rise of these types of modalities and the increasing ability to apply AI/ML in various areas of decision support, we see a strong opportunity for better ecosystem collaboration to advance these types of approaches and allow for more personalized approaches, right? So the more kind of data context we're able to bring in to our decision making, the more we're able to augment some of those decisions and support kind of more individualized care for patients. And we do see many cross-industry partnerships, and we have continued to see these for a while. And we expect to continue to see more of them, which is kind of some of the genesis around some of the work that ZS and BeeKeeperAI have done to address some of the pain points that are listed here on the left-hand side. So while there is significant promise in the application of these tools and developing the tools is only half the battle, there are kind of systemic barriers that we consistently see in our work in this area. One is the lack of trust around kind of these solutions. There is a black box dynamic or sometimes a homegrown dynamic within the creation of these solutions. And there's a need for third party or like readily accepted peer review confirmation around these solutions before they can be readily accepted and adopted within kind of the broader healthcare context. This requires engagement from healthcare entities, often beyond kind of the individual sponsors of these solutions. So there's a need to bring together the creator of the solution, the healthcare entity that will implement the solution and drive the workflow change, all while taking into account considerations around regulatory and compliance, which are frequently complex and nuanced in this space. Finally, there can be excellent solutions that can be verified in a clinical trial or in a research context, but need to be scaled appropriately. And this is an area where our team has done substantial thinking about. And the current paradigm requires often custom integrations within individual hospitals or within individual practices. And this kind of frame for how to properly deploy kind of these individual best of breed solutions to achieve scale is a very important barrier in this space. And then finally, the deployment paradigm and the care process change required to move from a valuable clinical indicator to value created in the care process change. So all of these are consistent barriers that we feel need to be addressed in a multi-stakeholder kind of ecosystem type of approach. I'll hand over to my colleague Chin to discuss some of the progress we've made and the frames that we've created for addressing some of these barriers.
Thank you, Maurice. Just also a brief introduction about myself. I'm Dr. Chi, partner at the ZS Associates. I'm part of a leadership team for our medical and evidence practice. I'm myself as a trained physician, implementation outcome researcher. Over the last 20 plus years, I had a experience working on both health system and the life sciences end. Starting to see the exciting age that data and AI-driven approach starting to more systematically have an opportunity to really improve patient care at large. And this is definitely a topic I'm very passionate personally. And I think when we're looking at all the different type of clinical development, the decision support system from development to deployment in the last 10 or plus years, the consistent learning from those programs or the solution bring to the market that require a much more integrated approach by leveraging a trusted ecosystem and having a wide range of relevant stakeholders that with common shared objectives to enable not only the solution creation, but also the actual adoption and deliver the intended impact. As we know, the key players in this ecosystem, including clinical decision support solution owners, the company that primarily focus on clinical decision support tools, platforms, responsible for scaling CDS solution, creating commercially viable approach to drive adoption. Then you have health systems, the providers. And then health systems, not only they are enabler of such solution, there also could be a primary stakeholder to driving the adoption to help to achieve the quadruple aim and many other patient-centered outcome objectives. For provider, of course, I think how to actually making personalized decisions for their patients, making the right decision, choosing the right treatment, identify and screen patient at the right time, but also having the broader capability to leverage the data to really identify care gaps that could benefit their patients are definitely the core objective that matter to those stakeholders. Then you have a lot of companies, including company of large technology companies and as well as the service companies are serving as a deployment partners. And the department partners needed looking at the way how to make sure the solution can be validated, has the proper adoption track at the system level across their key clienteles. But also there's an aspect related to how to measure the impact, how to really creating a positive feedback loop. And then there's many others, including payers, life sciences, medical associations, and also patient advocacy groups that I think the adoption of such a technology, having a trusted way, reliable way to deliver that measurable impact, really matter to all those key stakeholders. Are we creating more sustainable healthcare? Are we creating a healthcare system that actually can deliver all the key objectives for all key stakeholders? I think by and large, we have seen a lot of collaboration starting to forming and evolving within the market. Um, but by and large, the more you start looking at the multi-stakeholder perspective, the more you actually establish a more trusted ecosystem, the higher chance for really the winning solution to actually get the impact that delivered. And then there's also big terminology called implementation science. There's actually much more to it. We have seen, it's actually required taking a very systematic approach to looking at how to really identify the right problem to solve, build a solution, but not also only taking a more advanced technology, AI, data-driven approach, but actually bring the key stakeholders through this whole systematic process from aligning what's the key problem trying to solve, what's the strategic imperative that matter to all the key stakeholders, and in parallel, looking at the way fit for purpose data, the modeling capabilities, and other solution development capabilities to build the initial high-performing approach and a solution. But many of those solutions, if they're only leveraging, a certain set of data or only leveraging a certain set of methodology, it does require pretty systematically a well thought out, a well designed real world testing, and through the pilot programs. And that is a stage. Is also not only testing the model performance and the solution performance, but also getting the key end user user champions and the right stakeholder at the health system level, potentially payer level, to engage at those pilot programs to making sure the objective are right, the approach is reliable, and it actually doesn't really add the burden to the physicians as well as to the patients. And those key pilots actually identify whether this is the right solution, can be something trusted, is very important, become the foundation for this to be scaled. And then typically also at this stage, you have to start thinking about what will be the commercial strategy, what will be the scaling strategy. So we have seen a lot of programs that may actually only end up at pilot phase, didn't really scale from that point out. May not be the model, the solution itself are not reliable, not meaningful. There's no clear model to carry it forward. Who's owning the IPs, who's the actual one going to make the solution more mature, much more reliably deployed, and has the kind of a right alignment that actually driving that kind of adoption. And this is the area we started to see solution like BeeKeeperAI bring to the table, going to help to eliminate some of the key pain point of fictions. And then in our next couple of slides, we're going to share some case study. Not just that we actually did a very meaningful work, but we actually learned a lot. When you're working with the current state, when there's a lack of some key component of your processes, how some of those approaches going to be, still eventually maybe achieve your goal, but it may take a much long-winded journey to get there. So one of the key example is we've been working with a leading global biopharma company on develop and deploy a high precision hepatitis C patient prediction model. One of the key challenges for hepatitis C market is, or patient population, is the disease itself still largely asymptomatic until the patient are quite severe. Maybe already developed fibrosis, maybe already develop potentially the late stage tumors, other aspect, with the hepatitis C being untreated. But in the early stages, right, the disease is hard to detect. So there is a universal screening guideline that from a Fed level. Overall, the adoption of universal screening has been slow. The core pain point for that issue is it is actually require HCPs to screen 30 to 100 patients to identify one positives. So imagine that in your daily workflow as a physician, that you basically are throwing the darts on the wall to see what happens. Combined with the other priority you have for managing your patient care, this become a less important aspect for you to run it because it's not super reliable. So we actually spent a few years to actually work with this client to creating a very high performing model. We're actually thinking through all the core processes to make this model that pragmatic, that actually can be embedded into the physician workflow. We have the model actually deployed into a large health system with our partners. We actually learn a lot through this whole process. But if we want to go back to looking at what are the key takeaways, we do feel a lot of the approach in this whole project can be done differently, much more effectively, efficiently. So maybe move on to the next slide. What are the key takeaways? One key thing is we want to look at, what kind of data you want to use. We started our last project using more retrospective data, de-identified. It's well representing into certain subpopulation, but certainly it's not going to be as generalizable as what we can imagine the real world data in the real world settings. But there was challenge to actually, starting your modeling with that kind of real world settings in the real time basis. That's one. Two is when we're looking at, creating the solution, we also starting to understand what's the different stakeholder perspectives. There's a lot of aha moment in the whole process. It would be better to actually getting the multi-stakeholder aligned at the beginning, so that we're not, looking at what really matter to what kind of stakeholder objectives as a fresh learning, but rather as a more aligned, pre-aligned strategy for it. There's also aspect related to the testing of such solution into the real world settings. There's a very cumbersome process steps to get there. The overall, from a model being created to put them into real world settings, that itself takes several months time frame, because we have to actually have to really adapt them to that kind of model, which in many cases, when you create a model, you don't really have that kind of experience. You don't really have that anticipated deployment environment to test against. But we still achieve quite significantly. One is the model itself helped to improve the HCV diagnosis screening ratio more than 10 times. The model is highly accurate, although we could actually missing some patient. If we can actually add in more clinical features and the real world setting findings into the model development, I think we are confident we can improve that, not only the accuracy, but also the reliability of identifying any patient have any level of risk in this whole process. So having that feedback loop that built into the model and also deployment, the testing will be highly valuable. And then we created this model. Now it's being leveraged, and then the actually key publication going to come out in the next few months. Is we also learn operationally how to do this more effectively, more efficiently. One key thing is also missing. We haven't really think about what will be the commercial strategy. Who's going to be able to taking on this model moving forward to incorporate into the current CDS solutions, and having a reliable track to adopt. So those are the key things we're also learning from it. One key thing I do think, it's totally feasible in today's world using machine learning, deep learning, generative AI. I think we can actually create amazing solutions. But how do you create? I think what we're missing in the project was that kind of trusted ecosystem that with the governance carried through every step away. So I'm going to pass on to Mary Beth to talk about how BeeKeeperAI are actually trying to tackle this type of problem.
Chen, thank you so much from the lessons from the field. So BeeKeeperAI was working with a global biopharma with an algorithm that detected pediatric patients that were at risk for a very rare genetic condition. And because the data sets were so small and the actual diagnosis required genomic data, there was really no way to use de-identified data for the algorithm. in terms of validating it in the real world. So what the biopharma company had done, they had used some de-identified claims data, and unfortunately, this genomic condition also does not have a specific claims code associated with it. So the model that came in was within what I'm going to call the neighborhood of the actual condition and genomic condition, but they were extremely interested in enabling their algorithm, protecting its intellectual property while it was computing on the real clinical data that included case notes and also genomic data and social determinants of health. So they came to us with that challenge and said, we're really interested in using Escrow AI, the privacy enhancing platform that you all have, in order to validate and begin to achieve generalizability of our algorithm to help the average pediatric or pediatrician identify patients who would really benefit from a referral to a specialist to examine the condition. The challenge with the condition was it looked like 20 other potential genetic conditions. There was an overgrowth attached with it in terms of physical conditions. And unfortunately, it was taking families and children 7 to 10 years to get an accurate diagnosis, while there was really already an FDA-approved treatment that would slow the growth of the overgrowth and help to contain it effectively. So clearly, there was a mission here to alleviate suffering by identifying these patients using AI. And so quite a powerful solution there. But as many of you on this call know, there were sizable hurdles in the old paradigm of show me your data, send the data. So because the data set was small, as I mentioned, and because of the type of data that it would have only been permitted within an academic medical center under a consented clinical trial, which would have taken much longer and would have been far more expensive to do. But because the data remained at the academic medical center and because the patient identification was protected at all times, the academic medical center agreed to provide full PHI, the full clinical record, for this algorithm to compute against within the academic medical center environment. So one of the world-renowned experts happened to practice at this particular center. She curated and had a gold standard patient data set of this particular genetic overgrowth of patients that she had been treating throughout her whole career. And the gold standard data set were 27 patients. She added in 2,000 more patients who had some of the 20 other genetic conditions that were very similar. And then the algorithm was encrypted and sent to the academic medical center environment to compute against this highly specialized, very small data set. And not surprisingly, because you're moving from computing on de-identified data to real clinical data, the model actually ended up, it was not performing optimally once it hit the real clinical data. And we'll talk about what we did with that in a minute. But, the contracting process typically for these is very challenging, and typically there's a bit of a misalignment between the budget cycle within biopharma and the approvals process, and then the long-term ongoing product development life cycle for AI ML models that are destined to be CDS solutions. So, and typically there's not intellectual property protection when you send a model for computing on data within a data steward's environment. So our approach was we needed to enable computing on the real world protected health information. We needed to maintain the privacy of both the model's intellectual property and also patients' data. But we also needed to ensure that those two could come together and compute. So what we ended up doing on the next slide is bringing those two pieces together through Escrow AI. And I'm not going to talk in depth about Escrow AI. I'm just going to mention that this is a new technology-enabled workflow, SaaS application that embeds a number of privacy-enhancing technologies and automates the use of that across the AI and ML development lifecycle. So as the biopharma brought the model in and it computed on the data, you can see there was a significant decline in its performance. And then through the course of 2 months, they iteratively trained on additional data sets within the academic medical center. And ultimately, on the next slide, we're able to achieve some very significant results. So in terms of the overall model performance, they achieved a 40% improvement in the overall performance, so sensitivity and specificity. They were able to actually compute on a gold standard clinical real-world data set, and they were also able to license that data set to remain available inside of the academic medical center for iterative training or third-party validation. This particular model was not requiring regulatory approval, so it was just a matter of keeping the data for third-party validation and demonstration. I think the more significant learning for me, I was working at the University of California, San Francisco at the time that this project was underway. And I had been in the business development role and struggling through the contracting process, struggling to get data for incredibly promising and innovative projects. And because we were able to provide technically the protections and essentially establish a zero trust environment where we could escrow the IP and escrow the data, but allow them to compute with. The attorneys agreed to reduce the contracting document itself from 28 pages down to 10. The BAA was waived, and IRB agreed that patient consent was not required because the patient data was never seen, nor did it ever leave UCSF in this particular example. So that, as you think about the scaling and the time to market and the speed to market for these very promising AI solutions that literally can transform parents and children's lives, this was a very encouraging step forward. Now, talk about multi-stakeholders. So, you all know we had to have conversations with lawyers, conversations with the Data Security Committee, conversations with the IRB, but ultimately what we were able to do because of the shared mission of improving the health of patients and families, we were able to get those stakeholders on board and aligned. And what we've done as beekeepers document those learnings and harvest that so that we can share that now with our clients as we're working with them. But the bottom line is you saw the 30 iterations of training, iterative training that they did on the model, on the real world data, that was completed in less than 2 months. So from a cold start of, hey, I have an idea, to the final report and the optimized performance of the model, it was a total of 7 months. So now we're talking about real time getting solutions to market at the speed of software, and yet doing it safely and doing it in a way that preserves privacy and is regulatory compliant. So the real world impact, huge. So a greater than 50% improvement in the model's performance in terms of sensitivity and specificity. It also will alert now pediatricians that a patient would benefit from a referral to a specialist for assessment, and we were able to maintain the IP protection and therefore its value as it moves forward into the market.
Mary Beth, there's one question in the chat, just wanted to call to your attention. So Abby is asking, in this use case, did the academic research center not want IP rights given that it was their data set that improved the model? If you could speak to that.
Yes, I certainly can. And that's an insightful question because typically our academic medical center had demanded all IP rights if they contributed something to the algorithm. What they waived that requirement in this particular case because my argument with them was, with the attorneys, was you cannot demonstrate the specific contribution that the data makes to the improvement of the algorithm. It's almost non-specifiable. So you have to do this from the point of training against that data to improve the overall performance in order to impact health and outcomes. So it aligns with mission. And fortunately, they agreed with that position. Now, I have talked to other data stewards that take a little bit different stance, but I'm finding that as a general rule, they're more willing to have that discussion around waiving IP rights, especially if you're coming in with a model that's already developed and simply needs to be trained and validated against a data set. Now, if it's de novo training that you're doing jointly with a PI at that institution, that's a different discussion completely. Yeah, great question. Okay, Jason, next slide. I think we're at the end for questions. So Chen, I'm curious, as you've been working, one of my observations in working in the life science space is the life science companies are so highly disciplined, and you and I work together at Pfizer, so, you know, let everybody on this call know, you know, there's a great discipline around the pipeline, and especially when they're looking at compounds and pharmacotherapy. One of my observations about the digital side is it's really an emerging discipline of pipeline management versus digital projects. But I would love your perspective, you and Maurice both, your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think the life science digital health functions for some of the leading pharma actually have that dedicated team and truly looking at bring digital solution to the market, either helping bring the digital solution to the market or creating and owning that to the market. It is still an evolving landscape. I think many of pharma companies that they see the necessity to have that capability, as we can imagine. So even if you have the best treatment for your patient, if a patient not being screened and diagnosed on time, or the treatment hasn't been even considered because the treating physician don't really have a data at their fingertip, and with the right CDS support to be able to see the tree beyond the forest, right? Then the consideration would not really come into play. So I think for life sciences that to getting their innovative solutions and pharmaceutical products and other devices to be used for the right patient that require that kind of capability. But the commercial model and also how pharma can enable such solution to be developed, validated, and adopted, I don't think right now there's a common proven, playbook for it. So that's why I'm saying it's still kind of evolving. I think Maurice has been helping many of our large life science companies to create their digital health strategy, helping them to understand the landscape, help them to figure out what's the role, the right role for life science to play, and how they should be collaborating with the ecosystems. So I'd like him to chime in a little bit more on that perspective too. I think you're on mute.
It's a really great question. I think overall, we see substantial increasing maturity, I think, across many of the players in the healthcare system. I would encourage, the folks on the call to maybe think about where your organization is in terms of how you're thinking about how to apply such promising tools versus where you were maybe 5 years ago. And to me, a lot of that maturity has translated into more upfront thinking about all aspects of how the solution creates value. So right from the gate, understanding some of the implementation science considerations, some of the sustainability considerations that Chin was mentioning, some of the how will this be scaled, and some of the considerations that Mary Beth brought up about, maybe the data that we have as a starting point might not be sufficient. We need to see several steps down the road of needing to compute on real data, needing to co-create with perhaps multiple institutions, right? Understanding like the IP question that was brought up is tremendous. So I think there are many groups, and I'm assuming some of the folks on the call are part of those groups, who have gone through a couple cycles of this, or who have had situations where they've built something, but it has not scaled well for various reasons. And so I think people are trying to take some of those learnings and pull it forward to the beginning and thinking about, which approaches make sense and how to set projects up for success so they really can get out there and create patient value.
Maurice, where do you see sort of the bigger, more near-term opportunities in that overall process? Where are the big wins or the low-hanging fruit, so to speak?
That is a really good question. To a certain extent, it is driven by kind of the degree of baseline maturity in various arenas. I would say a lot of organizations we work with are organized by TA and think by TA. And I think there's varying degrees of maturity in certain areas around application of AI ML decision support or willingness to adopt these types of tools, as well as kind of underlying platforms that are not necessarily EHR, but platforms such as the Beekeeper platform or other platforms that enable you to kind of multiplex or reach out and get data or reach out and get into workflow. And I think the emergence of those platforms is a big change that we've seen over the past, let's say, 3 or 5 years, which are starting to create maybe credible possibilities of scale, but they are also very kind of TA specific. They have different footprints, different kind of, types of workflows that they can get into, the difference between AMCs versus community oncology clinics, the difference between being able to compute on kind of like basic health record data versus if you need lab or genomic data. All of these are like nuanced considerations, right? And I think there are certain areas where some of these platforms have more fully emerged, or there's kind of more lower hanging use cases. And we are seeing kind of our clients try and find those use cases and apply them primarily to patient identification. Right.
Yeah, we've had several conversations about that as well.
I was just going to say we have another comment in the chat. It's not a question, but maybe we can chat about this topic. So Abby shares that anti-kickback is playing a much more central role in the commercialization of digital health tools from a life science perspective, and even in partnership with external healthcare technology companies. So curious, Mary Beth, Jin, and Maurice, if you could talk a little bit about how you see the anti-kickback dynamic playing out with the commercialization of these digital health tools.
So because I need Chen and Maurice's counsel on this, we have been hitting great struggles with the compliance folks inside of biopharma because of their concerns about anti-kickback. So I'm going to defer to my expert colleagues on this.
I will just say it's a really good point. It is one of probably the top 3 kind of alongside kind of is it a SAMD or not? What is our regulatory structure around the intended use of how far are we going to get into decision making part, as well as some of the patient privacy considerations that we've been talking about here. It is definitely one of kind of like the top 3. We have a strategic compliance function within ZS, work very closely with that group on an individual case-by-case basis. I'm sure the folks on this call are probably familiar with kind of the dominant paradigm in the space, which is like for like exchange, right? I'm giving you something of value, but it's relatively low value, or I'm going to characterize the value as low enough such that what I'm getting back from you evens out, whether that's insights or data or something similar. That there's pros and cons of that structure, right? The alternate structure is to set some kind of fair value for the solution that you are providing and ask for fair remuneration. We have seen instances where that can be done if the value is relatively modest compared to, say, the clinical rationale of the solution or kind of the interest around the solution by the other party. But that, again, on a case-by-case basis. right? So I think there's no way around one of those two paradigms, especially as we're talking about tools that are being used for prescribers, for organized customers. In those structures, anti-kickback is a very real concern, right? I think if you start from first principles, which is everyone is trying to find patients, shorten time to meaningful diagnosis, etc., those are good first principles to start from, right? Working above brand, working in a space where you're trying to support clinician decision making in a way that is not overly linked to your particular product or interfere with that decision making. I think those are all important kind of paradigms to start from that set us up for success as we think about doing this in a compliant way. But then kind of there are details below that that we need to get into with our regulatory specialists.
Maurice, does that end up meaning that as part of that AI life cycle, the measurement of value needs to be a key factor that's taken into consideration sort of earlier in the product development life cycle? Or what models have you seen that have been working well?
And maybe Maurice, as you answer that, I think it layers nicely with another question we got from Eric Scott in the chat. It kind of speaks to what risks do CDS developers assume when adopting an agile development process, given FDA's recent guidance on SAMD and sort of predetermined change control plans for machine learning enabled medical devices. So maybe Jen, Maurice, love your input on that as well.
Also an excellent question. Perhaps highlighting another one of those three main considerations, right? That we're talking about. I think it is probably worth highlighting, Eric, to your question, that many entities that we are working with are trying to carefully straddle the line around what the intended use is and whether their device truly is a class 2 medical device or not. And we do a lot of work where that is left open, where it's upfront. We even consider kind of alternatives, like under one particular intended use where this is a class 2 medical device, how much sharper can we get in our guidance to clinicians versus if we consider an alternate kind of lighter intended use where it's deliberately not a regulated device, how much do we have to blunt the type of guidance we give or provide kind of, walk back the type of guidance we give. And so in many instances, we're considering those paths and balancing kind of what will the clinical value be relative to the time and effort investment, right? And so the topic that you are bringing up, which is the kind of the evolving FDA guidance on AI, ML, SAMD, how does that influence this and change the decisions? It definitely has, I think, as you get down to this path of, yes, I'm going to build a SAMD, and it is kind of at its core a AI/ML algorithm, which Chin was mentioning. There is a whole life cycle around kind of maintaining those algorithms and sharpening them, et cetera. And that life cycle is at odds with kind of the medical device structure, right? From an FDA context. And so I think that the guidance here is positive in terms of trying to bring those things close together, right? In terms of, predetermined change, et cetera, allowing for some controlled evolution of models. But I would say in this space, a lot of teams we're working with are actually trying to avoid that branch entirely. I think you saw 2 case studies from both us and BeeKeeperAI today that were not SAMDs, deliberately not SAMDs, intended just to augment clinician decision making. I don't know, Chin, if you want to chime in as well.
Yeah. I think, because there's a evolving regulatory landscape and there's still trust issues for different segment of health system players that engage in collaborating together. I think the way we're tackling this is let's solve the common foundational problems, the underdiagnosed issues, and then very clear evidence-based care gap issues. And then there's an aspect related to improve the overall efficiency, that helping patient to navigate their patient journey. But there are issues around, let's say, making very definitive recommendation to guide HCP's decisions. I think that's the area definitely you got to be very cautious, very discreet, looking at how to create a really reliable solution that actually fully tested well, most likely go through SMD pathways. Actually, touch about a little bit more the anti-kickback aspect too. If the goal is to addressing those foundational issues, and then you set up the governance in the right way, and have a clear role what life sciences versus payer versus provider are actually playing in that collaboration, that then you have less anti-kickback issues. But if your goal is to leveraging that kind of solution to drive primarily about driving your product adoption, I think that would be something much harder to navigate to plan around. So.
Any other questions from the audience? If not, we will wrap up. I know we'll be following up with a survey. Chen, Maurice, any final thoughts or comments?
I think one key thing I feel, we talk a lot about compliance. We talk a lot about creating a trust ecosystem. But if we take a step back, I do think we're in this exciting age with the massive data, rapid evolution of AI, machine learning capabilities. I think we need to collaborate closely and then channel our energy to really addressing the fundamental goal, which is improving patient outcomes. I think with that intent, with that overall passion, synergy, I think the future is going to be very bright.
Great. Maurice, any final comments before we sign off?
No, thank you for the discussion and the questions. I appreciate some of the informed questions from the group, and agree with Chen, right? All the pieces are there. It's just about getting the data where it needs to get to create valuable algorithms, proving them out in a trusted way, and getting them back into workflow in a scalable way, which is, I think, what tools like yours, Mary Beth, are trying to help us do on behalf of our clients. So that's kind of the real future promise in this space.
Well, thanks everyone for attending today. We've enjoyed our time with you, and we appreciate you spending time with us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.